Okay, Dominique O'Rourke, thank you so much for joining us once again.
It's absolutely my pleasure. It's my 1 month anniversary from being sworn in, and so
Is
your
that
timing's
right?
perfect. It is.
Okay, perfect. Yes, well, the timing is also perfect because you've been very, very busy, and I want to get to all of that. But first of all, um, how did it feel to be back? Because you're famously once a page. You worked in the House of Commons, and now you're back in a very different capacity.
I am. So I was a page, I was a tour guide, and I was a parliamentary intern from 91 to 96. That was the window when I was on the Hill. Totally different to be sitting in my seat in the House of Commons. But I'm grateful because there's some familiarity then with proceedings and how that works. But obviously, it's really different when it's you in that seat. So, it was just amazing to make my first speech, to ask my first question, to answer questions. So, when you make a speech, then the opposition has 5 minutes to ask you some questions. So, all of that was definitely new to me.
I've been following some of that on Open Parliament. But first, just situationally, where are you seated so people can look for you on CPAC in the fall?
Okay, so I was shifted a little bit. So on my very first day, I was 4 rows behind the Prime Minister. So I say
Nice.
just outside of the splash zone. And then we elected a speaker on our very first day. And so everybody shifted because that speaker sat sort of somewhere to our left. Everybody shifted by one. And then the parliamentary secretaries were appointed, so we all shifted again. So now I'm two over from where I used to be. I'm directly behind François-Philippe Champagne now, who is our Minister of, so it's 4 rows behind François-Philippe Champagne, who's our Minister of Finance and Revenue.
Okay. Now that
So
we
right in the center. And actually, if you look, last Tuesday, I sat next to the Prime Minister at QP, so I was a lot easier to find that day.
I'm gonna go back and watch that tape. Um, but to get into issues and stuff, Bill C-5 was passed last week. Pretty big bill, does a lot of changes. And I'm gonna get combative right off the bat because, as you know, the Ontario government passed a big infrastructure bill of its own, and your former Guelph City Council colleagues essentially did a little hand slap. They voted a little hand slap, and I think it was because the size of it, the omnibus bill, it changes so much. And I was thinking a lot about Bill C-5 because it does a lot of the same thing. So, what is the difference between the federal government doing a big, massive omnibus bill like this that changes so much, and the Ontario government doing a big, massive omnibus bill that changes so much? Because I think, having observed you for 7 years at council, you probably would have joined your colleagues in that vote.
Absolutely. So here's why, and here are some major differences. So first of all, it's too bad that they have the same bill number, and then it's easy to conflate them. But we are under attack from the United States from an economic point of view, and we do need to be shoring up our economy with nation building projects in a very fast way. Here are two major differences, though, between C5 and Ontario's Bill 5. C5, it's not a big bill, has two parts. And the first part is not very controversial. It eliminates federal interprovincial trade barriers. So the provinces still have their work to do because they have their own interprovincial trade barriers, but it eliminates federal interprovincial trade barriers so that we get to that one economy and not 13. So that's not very controversial at all. The second part, I don't believe should be as controversial as it has been. It has 5 criteria. So it means to speed up processes for nation building projects so that we can get people working on them in a faster, more coordinated way. Now, I'll give you the example that I've seen at the city. You have a proponent on a project, and then that file goes sequentially to all the departments, and everyone can comment, and it goes back to the proponent, and they come back with a different plan, and it goes around again, but it can take a lot of time. So, federally, when we do that, governments change, things change in the economic climate, and it can really slow things down. So, in terms of a process change, there will be one minister who is responsible. However, they are still required, the proponent still has to provide all the documentation. That minister is still required to consult with the required federal departments. And in those 5 criteria, three, like one is, it has to be in the national interest, but three of them really give me a lot of comfort. One is the project has to have a reasonable, possibility of success. Okay.
Hmm. Hmm.
So if you were going to have a project that was going to have a lot of opposition, it's a non-starter, right? The fourth bullet in that list is significant consultation and also economic participation of Indigenous communities.
Hmm.
Okay, so there has already been quite a bit of consultation. The Prime Minister has announced more consultation and participation with Indigenous groups. We are still subject to Section 35 of our Constitution, and we will obviously meet our commitments under UNDRIP. And so if you listen to what the Minister of Natural Resources is saying, this is real economic sovereignty on projects that are touching Indigenous communities. And so you're going to see more consultation this summer, but this can be a real game changer for Indigenous communities that choose to participate. And I would say if an Indigenous community, or a First Nation rather, was really opposed to something, you wouldn't meet that third criteria. So we
Hmm.
really are looking at project in the national interest that will be good for First Nations, good for community, like good for the general community, good for Canada. The fourth piece that has people concerned is around environmental protections. So
Hmm.
the minister responsible will take all that information from all the ministries, but it's at the same time, right? And it's very clear who the decision maker is. So they will list conditions that need to be met. Okay. And those will be public
Hmm.
and very transparent. So people can see what exemptions are we talking about? What are we not talking about? And so, but to be predetermining that on a list of hypothetical projects, this is just framework. And
Okay.
it's a framework that also what that fifth bullet says is it is particularly interested in clean energy and anything that advances our shift to net zero. So it doesn't say net zero, but it talks about clean energy. So to me, those things are really enshrined in C-5, and I'm
Hmm.
happy to talk with people at length about that.
Oh, well, let me just lift off a couple of things that you made a note of, and I think one is the Indigenous portion because I think that in Ontario especially because of both of the fives, Indigenous people are feeling a bit besieged. It seems that Prime Minister Carney has taken the same tact as Premier Ford, which is like let's just pass the thing and then we'll do our consultation. Is that not backwards though? When we're talking, and obviously I don't expect you to address the Premier Ford piece of this, but is that not backwards? And that I think the Indigenous people would have preferred and First Nations communities would prefer like the consultation up front rather than just like, okay, we're doing it and then we'll talk to you.
So C-5 is just the framework,
Okay.
right? It's just the framework. And what that framework now says is that these are the five critical components. And then when there is a project and there are proponents, the
Hmm.
affected First Nations will then have real consultation, right? But that list of projects is not done yet,
Okay.
right? So what this does, it creates the framework. And I've talked with a number of people, and I've got a meeting set up with the Mississaugas of the Credit in I think next week. So what is being proposed a little bit is you should have consulted, but on projects that don't exist. And so who do you consult then? Because
Hmm.
the duty to consult is for projects that are going to affect those First Nations, potentially really for the betterment of those communities from an economic participation point of view. What we don't talk about also is we have doubled a loan guarantee so that Indigenous communities that want to benefit from whatever project. And again, I'll say if those Indigenous communities aren't interested in those projects, I think they're a non-starter.
Okay.
So, so this is the framework for those consultations. The Prime Minister has announced additional consultations so people are comfortable with this framework. We will meet our conditions under the Constitution and we will meet our commitments under UNDRIP. And I would say again to that, needs a likelihood of success. Why would the federal government move forward on a project that's going to be tied up in the courts? It makes no sense because the goal is to get people working and on these projects of national importance. These are important from a sovereignty point of view, and they're important from an economic point of view, and really they're important from an Indigenous sovereignty point of view as well.
Right. And for people who may not be aware, UNDRIP is United Nations Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous People, just so
Yeah,
we're not throwing around acronyms and if people may not know. But
that's fair.
I guess what the question is, as you described it, if it is a framework, I guess where did the communications piece of this, like, consultation, it doesn't just, start at the very specific endpoint you get to. So you've approved a framework, but was there a piece of this missing to maybe assuage the fears of First Nations communities that this wasn't a, a bulldozer coming at them when the legislation was put on the floor?
Right. So I would say a couple of things. And the person who put it best, because, don't take my word for it. Our Minister of Indigenous Affairs, Mandy Gulmasti, or Minister Gulmasti, said this at the press conference on Friday, that what she has been hearing from the Prime Minister at the cabinet table in caucus is consistent with what was passed and what was being put forward and the intention. And so that's a really great clip. I think I shared it on my social media, but it's worth listening. We have the largest, so this does not preclude us from a broader consultation, but we have the largest Indigenous caucus in Canadian history of people who are close to their communities. There have also been a couple of amendments, so we were clearly listening. What is troubling people is the speed here.
Hmm.
And so that is what's troubling, but it's also what's necessary. So if we are going to have these projects of national importance to get people working, because we are feeling the impacts of these tariffs, right? We are feeling the threats from the United States in terms of slowdown. So how do we shift our internal production? How do we, and it goes with that first piece about the interprovincial trade barriers, right? Removing those.
Right.
How do we get people working as quickly as possible and those approvals as quick as possible, right? Approvals within 2 years. So, and I should say the bill also has a sunset clause at 5 years. So this is about here's the incentive to shorten these timeframes. So this is not a bill in perpetuity. This is about
Hmm.
meeting this moment in a way that benefits Canada the best.
Right.
So that speed can't be achieved if you're going to lose 6 months on waiting until the fall and having the consultations and right. And so the framework can be informed certainly by the conversations with Indigenous communities and leaders this summer, which has been announced and promised. And then the more specific mechanics of that consent piece will happen when there are specific projects, right?
Hmm. Okay.
So the speed piece, if you wait till the fall and introduce a bill and go through committees and all that stuff, you're going to lose half a year in
Right.
what we're trying to speed up in terms of a process that will be good for Canadians and for Indigenous communities. And one thing I always heard at council was on climate, right? Do more, do it faster, right?
Hmm.
Well, this allows us to do things faster for wind projects, for hydroelectricity, and we want to get those shovels in the ground in a way that is respectful of the rights of Indigenous people and the duty to consent.
I'm glad you mentioned council because that was my second follow-up, which is, this, sitting in planning meetings, any project can get like sizable objections. And, we saw that in NIMBYism. I still see it because I still go to the council meetings, but, something goes up on somebody's corner, you can get five neighbors easily to come to council and say, we're darn some against it. How do you avoid, I guess, NIMBYism on a national scale with this? If one of the caveats is we kind of all have to agree that we want to get this going because I'm not, is that a standard we can reach on these massive projects?
So again, I think we're not going to, what gets on that list is not going to be projects with massive opposition. Why?
Mm,
You wouldn't be able to get them done. And so there are projects. So the Prime Minister was at the Premier's conference. Like, think about what has happened in the last month, and it's pretty amazing, right? The Premier's conference, the G7, now the Prime Minister's in Europe meeting with NATO leadership. Um, there's a lot going on. And so I think there are projects where communities are ready. And I'm thinking of hydroelectricity between Quebec and Newfoundland and Labrador. Historic things. I think provinces are ready to lead, and there are communities that are very interested in seeing some of these projects.
Okay. I want to move on to a different bill, C2. I know there are a lot of concerns that people have about potential civil rights issues, potential issues for new Canadians, immigrants, refugees. But I want to start from this point, which is, does C2 not play into Donald Trump's frame that the Canadian border is dangerous and it needs like immediate action? Is that not accepting his, I think, imagined view of the border or of our common border?
So it's both and,
Okay.
right?
Okay.
So some of the things that C2 does is it allows our Coast Guard to be patrolling the Arctic, which you would have thought, maybe I thought, they would have been doing that already,
Sure.
right? And so that enforces our sovereignty and our security in the Arctic and counts towards our defense spending, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, we have an issue with auto theft in this country. Okay. C2 will allow for some cargo that is outgoing. Right now, they can only inspect cargo that is incoming. So that is a protection that people have been asking for.
Mm-hmm.
C2 also has some provisions in terms of internet use, etc., that child exploitation experts and the chiefs of police have been asking for a long time. And it's not sort of open season on people monitoring your, online activity. And it can only occur in the context of an investigation. So I've talked with Guelph Police. I've attended a number of their sessions on IPV, on child exploitation, on human trafficking. They need the modern tools that they don't currently have in order to get to people faster when it matters. And so what they would be able to see is they can't see the content of anything without a warrant.
Mm-hmm.
They can see, hey, Adam has a Facebook page and Instagram page, but he got off X, or whatever.
No, I
So
haven't.
so no. And um so I think it equips our police departments within the context of an existing investigation to help save folks, frankly, especially children, faster. The questions around immigration will actually streamline. So there, again, there are things that you would assume would happen. For
Mm-hmm.
example, within the immigration department, you would assume they can share your file and your information among different programs, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that wasn't the case. This will allow them to share the file so that you're not, following up with different departments. Okay, so it brings down some of those barriers. It's a theme in this government. Um, the piece, and I don't have it open in front of me, the piece that people are concerned about in terms of reducing classes for refugee status is you can still appeal, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so what C2 is trying to do is actually speed up immigration processes so that it's actually a better process for newcomers. Because we hear that a lot, that it's taking too long. This will break down some of the barriers by facilitating the information sharing. And I would add, when government shares that data, they have information sharing agreements between whether it's federal and provincial or whether it's intra-departmental.
Right. And I think there's no question that the process needs to be better. There's no question that we have a car theft problem. You know, you get the Guelph police press release. That is apparent. But it's still, the Ontario Council of Agencies Serving Immigrants, the Migrant Rights Network, the Canadian Council for Refugees, these aren't kind of reactionary outlets who are all
Mhm.
saying the administration of these rules themselves, that changes these rules, who gets to claim refugee status, how that is overseen, they're waving a red flag. And I guess how are their issues being addressed? Because the Canadian Council for Refugees is saying that changes in C2 will disproportionately affect women and girls whose immigration status is tied to their husbands and fathers. So we're talking about people fleeing, domestic violence situations, people who have LGBTQ plus status. There seems to be real concern in these communities that some people will not be allowed to stay anymore.
Mhm. So I would say two things. One is that bill is under review, and people absolutely can contact me. They can
Hmm.
contact the parliamentary secretary or the minister. That will go to committee. And those are questions that we need to explore, right?
Hmm. Okay, good. That's a good note because it has not passed yet, and
That's
it is
correct.
still it is
Yeah.
still up for debate. Um, I want to look ahead a bit in the time we have left. To to what you just said, a lot has been happening, and the Prime Minister has been very busy. But there's summer. We like to think government gets the summer off, but it doesn't. Um, then we're going to be back at the House again in the fall. So what is coming up? We've done this one big thing, but what is next on your schedule, and what is the Prime Minister sort of made you aware of what's going to be coming down the pipe next?
All right. Well, first, I'd say we've done a lot of big things. So there's an income tax cut. The carbon tax has been eliminated. The consumer carbon tax has been eliminated from law. We've funded our military properly now for the first time, and we'll meet our NATO commitment, or first time in a long time. So there's a lot that has happened. What is coming up for me personally, I'm really excited to have been appointed to the industry committee, and I am chairing the Southwestern Ontario Liberal Caucus. So
Hmm.
we will be laser focused on tariffs, trade, steel and aluminum, really important for the area. And so I'll be meeting, there we are not taking the summer off. I'll be meeting with local leaders throughout the summer, as I was even in Ottawa. I'm making phone calls and meeting with folks there. And so I think that's what you'll see. You know exactly what has been laid out because it's laid out in the throne speech, and that is the government's plan. So the government's plan is really it is to stave off the impacts and the threats from the US while building a much stronger Canadian economy. So I have an economics degree. That's going to be my bent generally. You've seen it at council, you see it here, right? I didn't change my stripes. Um, because this threat from the US is very real. And it is a threat to our economy here in Guelph and our economy nationally. And without that, without a strong economy, without solid sovereignty, none of the rest can follow. So you're going to see some progress on these major projects, including clean energy,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And all the details are laid out in the throne speech, which has passed,
Hmm.
right? But that is the government's plan. But the priority you're going to see in terms of keeping people working, you saw some announcements this week on steel and aluminum tariffs, is critically important for Guelph.
Yes, absolutely. To wrap up, as noted, I have been following your doings in Parliament on the Open Parliament site. So just following up on one of those back and forths, can you just confirm for me something you got into with Ben Lobb from Huron Bruce, the MP for Huron Bruce, and just confirm for me that Guelph does in fact have pickup trucks?
We do. We do. Yes. Well, so that has been quite shocking. The degree to which the questions and speeches are used to provide disinformation and misinformation, because what happens is people then clip that and share it in their community.
Hmm.
So this sunset for the sale of gas-powered vehicles does not ban gas-powered vehicles. It moves us towards electric and hybrid vehicles. We will continue to have clearly gas-powered vehicles. So I would suggest, I mean, people who watch this podcast, listen, um, they're critical thinkers, and they're not probably as prone to misinformation, but there's a lot of it out there.
Yes, for
And I
sure.
think we need to be cautious. So, yeah, you know what? Tradespeople have pickup trucks and we need them, right? That is another thing that you're going to see in terms of a focus going forward is housing, obviously, the hot button issue, and the trades to build that. So, really good programs coming online for tradespeople, for apprenticeships, for people making a mid-career transition. You're going to see all of that.
Well, live from Guelph, home of many pickup trucks, Dominique O'Rourke, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Adam.